Welcome to an exciting episode of the Human Weapon System, where we talk about human performance which relates to the tactical, first responder, and law enforcement communities. Today, we have a great episode for you. As our guest today, we got Dr. Tony Acevedo. We're going to talk about the use of metrics in the return to mission process and a couple of other things that he kind of does above and beyond the scenes. Hey, Tony, welcome to the program.
Oh, man. Dr. Myers, I appreciate you, man. Thanks for having me. It's an honor.
Yeah. Well, we've been working quite a bit together on a couple of projects. It's great to kind of start talking shop and, record it and actually hold your feet to the fire. So say that jokingly. But hey, before we kind of get into this, I know a lot about you, but our audience does. So tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I guess I'll start from now and work my way backwards. Currently, I'm the senior researcher for 19th Air Force. So I'm embedded at Luke Air Force Base, which is our largest fighter wing in the world. We're mainly handle a lot of student pilots, and we're flying currently the F-16s and 35s here, where the F-35s are our 5th gen aircrafts, which they're going to start taking over our pipeline shortly. Beyond that, I test all the pilots, of course. But before this, I was in academics. I was a full-time faculty over at Grand Canyon University. And then before that, 20 years prior to that, I've been in the fitness industry. So mainly gym ownership, everything from a strength coach to general manager, the whole nine, all that good stuff. And I started off, as we're working backwards, 17 to 21 years old. I was in the United States Coast Guard. So I served from 01 to 05. Okay. And then anything before that's irrelevant because we all know in high school I was crazy. So
yeah, well, that's amazing. Yeah, it's a long and storied career that's continued to grow, which is amazing. Yeah, I mean, it's you have the opportunity to work the 16s and the 35s. I've had is an amazing experience. I got to see down at Wright Pat some of the retraining of the 16 pilots to 35s to walls. It's amazing what that technology can do, and I think it's not as much as we can talk about. But we're going to cover a lot today. The main theme of today is kind of that return to mission metrics and stuff, but there's other stuff we're going to talk about as well. And the reason I want to cover that is if you can see me, I'm a little banged up. So I'm going through that return to mission process. I got a plate in my arm right now. You see it here, stitches on the back of my head. So we're going to talk about that a little bit, especially in kind of what you're seeing here is similar to kind of what you experience with your population, especially pilots. You see a lot of neck and spinal and sometimes even shoulder injuries. Can you talk to us about that a little bit?
Yeah. So I would say, from the stand of time, anytime you're dealing with fighters, even these long haulers and rotary too, they're dealing with these same issues, similar issues. But specifically with fighters, whenever you have to pull a high amount of Gs, there's going to be some formation or some formality of neck issue or back. And that's usually one of our biggest complaints that we get here in this space is, oh, my neck hurts or my back is, feeling something. So in the grand scheme of things, my main focus once I got here, because I've been here for a little over a year now, was trying to find what metrics should we capture, what metrics make the most amount of sense, and then how do we utilize those metrics to either, one, get ahead of the pain, reduce the pain, or even try to prevent it at some capacity. Okay. So that has been my main focus. And, believe it or not, and some people might be in awe in this because I was a little, kind of confused when I got into this space. There is not a standard protocol. There's not standard or normative values of what neck force looks like or what endurance hold looks like. So a lot of this stuff is still being created. And inside of the literature, there is such a huge amount of paucity within fighter pilots because just kind of from experience here in the United States, we are very controlling of what we do with our data in the sense of, putting it out there into essentially the academic space or the published space. Yeah. So a lot of this stuff is more arbitrary than it is scientific. So we're just trying to make sure that we, one, do things that are scientifically backed, which we're creating. And then two, it's always with the pilot's best interest in heart is, how do we make sure that we just make them better pilots and really longevity, right? Like,
Yep.
so kind of caveating from that, just that conversation, just so people understand why it's such a big deal is, well, fighter pilots, the Air Force in itself, and, you know, all military branches invest a high amount, but Air Force in itself, when we think about F-35s, these 5th-gen aircraft, they're investing over $1 million in each pilot. So you think about that, like that is a huge bill for, you know, the military or just the taxpayers in a whole. So it's how do we keep pilots healthy longer and keep them operating in space? Because, you know, people need to understand that, you know, they're war fighters. Our air is our biggest combat metric, or one of our largest combat metrics, that we need to make sure that we have a healthy Air Force to combat that. And lo and behold, like everyone sees what's going on there in this world, like it might be inevitable that we're going back to some sort of conflict that it's going to be overseas. So we need to make sure that we have a very secure fighting force. So with that being said, going back to the neck and the back, right? So within the Air Force, just give the listeners an idea. So, you know, I'm not a pilot, and I understand this. I'm going to do a little chair flying right now, so just so you understand. So we'll go into, I'll give you an F-16-35. It's mainly what I work with. F-22s are a little bit different, but just so they understand. So an F-16 pilot, they have a little bit of incline in their seat. Well, the 35 is a little bit different, so they sit a little bit more forward. Well, the 35s in itself, they have these new awesome helmets. And I don't have to go through the acronyms with everybody, but the helmets, and it actually displays a lot of their metrics on their helmets. Well, as awesome as that is, well, it actually puts their head in a forward CG. So now we have to think about this gravitational force, which is coming down on them on this helmet, which is causing more force on the neck because it has to, you know, be withheld. Well,
so basically a compressive force, right?
100%, yes. So it's a GZ coming straight down, right?
Gotcha. Okay.
So just so the listeners understand it too. So think about every gravitational force. So, you know, I don't want to give metrics. It kind of bore everybody. So I'll give you an idea. So if a pilot is pulling 9 Gs, and that's the highest that a pilot's going to pull in the F-35, that's 9 times the weight. So if their head, easy math, so their head is 5 pounds, that's 9 times 5. You guys could do the math on their neck that has to be supported, right? So one of the bigger issues with it's ridiculous when you think of the metrics and you actually do the math on that. So when you think of that, and an F-35, because they're sitting forward, and if they're doing some formality of defensive maneuver and they have to look back because there's not rear mirrors. The cool thing is actually the 35s do have cameras all over the place and they can see it visually, but that's a whole other cool story. But but they do have to look back when they're fighting these defensive maneuvers. Well, they have to go into flexion, and then they have to go into this occipital extension, and then they have to look back. So you could think about the neck in itself. If they have to do this, and then they're adding 9 times the force on their neck, it is ridiculous on the strain that, you know, it's not even anterior. It's not even the sternocleidomastoids or the scalenes that have to overcome this. It's also the posterior neck muscles, which the research supports that. So Australia and the Finnish have a lot of good data that they expose on the force that's required to kind of keep the neck upright and withstand some of this stuff. You're overseas, you understand, you know, they tend to expose their data more than we do in the United States. Which bless their hearts. I appreciate them doing that. So long story short is, it is a metric that needs to be understood. And one of the questions that I asked myself coming into this position is, one, how much force needs to be produced by the neck to withstand these gravitational forces in addition to, and then how much endurance is needed. So if they're doing flight maneuvers and they're withstanding 9 Gs for 15, 30 seconds, sometimes 45 seconds, debating if they're dogfighting or not, how strong does the neck have to be to try to mitigate some of that repercussive pain that is onset after they land and they're like, oh my God, I'm smoked. You know, I'm going to be deniffed now because my neck hurts. And, you know, truth be told, we have to be preventative.
Can you explain what deniff? I know it is, but what does deniff mean?
So without understanding the acronym, denift is a terminology that's used when a pilot can no longer fly and they're medically withheld from flying.
Okay.
So Sorry, Chris, I appreciate you saying that,
That's
because
fine.
we could toss acronyms around all the time, and like,
Oh yeah.
I'm like, what does that mean? Like, yeah, I totally get it. So sorry to the listeners if I confuse them with that. But so, long story short, and we'll kind of get into the nuances of all that, what I just exposed, but I kind of just wanted to paint like the bigger, broad background of what's currently transpiring here and how important it is, because I mentioned the neck, but it also, you know, as we could talk about the mechanisms of the body, like cool, we're talking about the structural aspect of the neck, but it now goes down to the thoracic part, the middle part of the back. And then the lower part of the back too has so much stress from sitting and everything else that goes along with that. So it is a compilation of a lot of issues that essentially, I hate to say this, it drives pilots out. And I'm saying that from just hearing conversations of pilots, so where it's like, why would I go through that amount of stress? So my responsibility and our responsibility as human performance practitioners is how do we start mitigating this? Do we train the neck more? Does the neck need to be trained more? Do these be stronger? Does that need to have more endurance? Like, what are some of these aspects that need to be introduced inside of the system? And those are some of the questions I've been, trying to answer. And I have some decent answers right now, but it just takes time. But we can get
It's great that you mentioned that, because you're talking about bringing, the medical side of it, which is HP really does, is taking it from reactive to preventative medicine. And I love the fact that you kind of detailed that out, and because it is the longevity of the pilots, but also post career as well. We owe it to them to kind of help make things livable, quality of life stuff. But I love how you're talking about using metrics to kind of identify, kind of those key limiters, that could help with prevent injury and stuff. Like, for example, you mentioned, neck endurance, neck strength. That's really kind of the big ones. There's not a lot of back metrics when it comes to the spinal column, especially with compression under, these types of G forces. But I want to take a few minutes to talk about your systematic process to identify the metrics, because you and I were kind of jaw-jacking before this thing. There's just so many metrics out there. We can measure almost anything, but is it worth measuring? Does it give you the information that you need? How do you identify the metrics, right? And let me back this up. Everyone kind of has their own system. I have my own way of doing it. But I'm curious on your way. How do you identify the metrics that you use, both for, just regular training, but also kind of that return to mission rehabilitation process?
100%. So when we think about return to mission, or just the mission in its whole, like it's always operational relevance, right? Like, what is your current population doing? And then how do we understand that? And that's like having a good grasp of understanding the physiology of the body is first and primary, right? Like, you understand like what's going on here. And then beyond that, then we have to understand like, how are those forces? So believe me as I tell you, so when I got into space, I had to really dig into what gravity really was. And, I teach kinesiology, and I could talk about 9.81 meters per second, all this squared and all this jet, but like, really understand it, right? So let's talk about what was being tested. So when I first got introduced into this space, it was physical therapists kind of started developing or kind of introduce some of these testing metrics for the neck. And it's not right or wrong, but they're not exercise physiologists. They don't see the human performance aspect. That's not their training or their schooling. So there was an issue with it, and there's still an issue with currently how we test that. So they do a cervical endurance hold test as their primary test for the neck. Now, here's the issue with that. So first thing, if we talk about paradigms, I am a post-positivist to where I love science. I like to embed my life in science, but I'm also empirical, right? Like, there's got to be a practicality to it. So I look at it and I see exactly what the neck's doing. And essentially it is a clinical type test. That's where a person will lie in the prone position. They will elevate their neck. It's essentially 2 fingers off of the platform, and they'll tuck their chin. And how long can they hold that chin tuck without any deviation from that? which in a clinical setting, it still doesn't even really have that much validity or reliability between it. And it's interrelated reliability. So it's like,
Oh, interesting.
you'll get a certain duration and I'll get a different duration. So I started looking into that and I was like, man, why are we doing this? And then I started digging into more of the research of like what muscles are really being affected. Well, when we're looking at cervical endurance, we're testing flexion. And I was like, well, there's a small aspect of flexion when a pilot has to bend their head down. I said, but it's the posterior aspect that really gets the brunt of it because they have to hold their head back from the gravitational force pushing down. So I'm like, well, why are we even testing that? And I was like, and you understand this, why would we test endurance without force? Or vice versa. I would never test those independently. I would always keep them in conjunction, right? So I was like, so they're leveraging and they're kind of holding their hat on this single metric. And lo and behold, they've kind of bolstered this up and they made such a big deal about it, our program. And I understand, like, inside of this space, it's still a funding aspect. Like, people need to understand, like, we got to get money to keep this things going. So they were really leveraging this aspect of like, oh, look, their neck holds get longer in duration. Well, as we know, if you train something, there's an adaptation to it and they get better at it, because most pilots have never held their chin down like this. And then I don't want to get too far into the weeds with this because some of it actually bothers me, but it's like the metric didn't mean anything because it wasn't an aspect of relevance to the flight. So like you look at it, so they test this and I was like, okay, well, I talked to pilots and I'm like, can you give me like a chair flying? Let me understand what you're doing. And I watch videos of, what, dog flying looks like. And I'm like, well, you're not doing this in a plane. I'm like, why would I test that? Like, there's got to be some formality of application to it. And then I looked at the muscular structure and I'm like, not the same. So
you're actually talking about doing kind of back up here because we're covering a lot, but you're really kind of talking about doing it. No, this is great. You're really talking about doing a needs analysis, right? And really understanding your population, who your clients are, and 100%. Versus just picking a clinical or even just a validated test to say you're measuring some in cause of this problem. You're actually taking the time to understand the physics, the physiology, and the mental stuff that go on with your population to understand the root cause of the issue you're trying to investigate. Is that kind of the good way of putting it?
No, 100%. Yeah. I mean, I even went to a point because when I analyzed the test, I didn't see the validity behind it. So then I even went to the point where, and this is where my active duty superiors got really mad at me for this, but I went to the point to where I wrote a review article and I submitted it to ASMA because it had relevance. And sadly enough, the title was Useless Metric or Useless Information. And from what I found, it was useless. It had no applicability to our population. Clinically, sure, PTs could use that in a clinical application, but this is a big difference than talking about whiplash. Like the acceleration aspect of it, plus, the capabilities of adding G's to it, like it is a big difference. So after I ruffled some feathers, I obviously, if you notice something wrong and if you don't have an answer, what's the point of noticing something wrong? So, of course, what I did is like, okay, cool. Well, we need to test force production because force production seems to be a better metric. And you have to test it in all planes of motion, rotationally, and, in every aspect, right? So then I contacted our Air Force Research Lab and I'm like, what are you guys doing over there, right? Because that's their whole purpose is to testing stuff. So I ended up talking to an engineer and, God bless their heart, but they're a very closed system over there. They keep things internal. So just chatting around, and the one engineer I spoke to said that, we've kind of created a pilot chair and we were using a dynamometer to test force production. I'm like, great idea. So I took that here and I worked with our engineers here and we we had an old F-16 chair, which they made into a testing parameter to where they used an arm, and it's almost done now. So I can't wait to start getting actually these metrics here. And sadly enough, we don't have them as of yet. But it's an arm dynamometer that's going to rotate and move around, and you can adjust the height of the seat to where, so a pilot will essentially be sitting in their cockpit, and I could able to test rotational force production in every plane of motion, sagittal, frontal, and all that jazz, and even, the transverse plane. So that is going to hopefully start giving me an answer. Now, it's going to take time because then I have to create normative values for everything to see what exactly is or isn't. But I have a proposal written up. So this way, what I'm going to do is my first order of operation is, one, test the force production of pilots. I'm going to use a visual analog scale of, capturing what they're paying. And now, granted, the VOS scale is not the best, but it's what we currently have, right? Yeah. So I'll assess what their pain is. They'll go fly their maneuvers or whatever it is. They'll come back, reassess their pain, and reassess their force production. So this way, I'll start actually getting objective measurements of what the decrement is, what's actually going on with the neck, and how much force is actually needed to be produced to withstand. So a lot of those things and those ideas came because, so I've boxed pretty much my whole life. I've wrestled. Yeah. And if you think of like going back to simplifying the whole thing, practicality wise, like what if boxers and wrestlers and football players from the stand of time, what have they always done? They trained the bejesus out of their neck because of all the blunt impacts and all that. So it's like, now what we did, so after understanding that, we started looking at how is the neck being trained inside of this population? Is it being trained? Is it being trained enough? So without keep rambling, keep going on. No, you're that's fine. Kind of where that's kind of where we are right now with understanding the neck is like, what's our next steps, right? Understanding how much force is needed to be produced to kind of withstand these gravitational aspects. And now, is more force better in reducing pain? Well, that science out there is kind of mixed on that. The circumference of the neck, like when we think about bigger necks, you should be able to produce more force. Does that mean less pain? Well, that's kind of mixed in a sense. So I'm currently writing a meta-analysis on trying to understand this in the current literature that's out there. And sadly enough, there's only 4 research articles that address this out there currently. Oh, wow. So beyond the paucity of data, it's something that needs to be answered sooner than later. And that's my role right now. And that's what I'm currently trying to do.
Okay. So you're really no, this is great. No, you're hitting on a significant point. So you actually, and that's the issue with the human weapon system populations, is there's usually very little data out there to kind of source a metric to kind of look at whether it's performance or return to mission, or if we improve this metric, does it reduce injury rates or does it improve recovery time, right? And that's the hard part. And that's, I think, honestly, that sounds like that's where you're at. Is you had the one test which had nothing to do with the muscles and part of the body involved. So you're actually having to go out and create your own metric. And so in order to do that, you need data. That takes time. You got to normalize it. Then you got to start doing the post hoc analysis of it. Is okay, does this metric, does it meet the goal of, if we improve this metric, I see an improvement in this metric, does it reduce our injury rates? Or if we see an improvement in this metric when a pilot's coming off injury, does that improve recovery time? And so you're not even to that stage yet. And that's usually what we're missing a good chunk in this field. And sometimes, and like you said, you sometimes have, and you alluded to it, you have to find an analog to kind of get you started. And that's what you're talking about, boxers, wrestlers, and mixed martial arts fighters. So it's really interesting that you're at the forefront of, you identified your research question, but you're having to create your own metrics to be able to get to where you want to go. It's pretty amazing.
No, and it's exciting, right? Like you and I were scientists. Like this is what gets us our jollies going, man. So that's an aspect. But like, let's talk about. So you're talking about return to play and stuff like that. Let's talk about what we do know, right? What we know is that in our space, when we deal with the human weapon system, we try to compare to something, right? And that's kind of like our starting point. Well, we can't compare to athletics, and we do this continuously, but athletics is light years ahead of where we are in the military space.
Yeah.
They have their metrics. They have a lot of their analysis already done. They already know what they're doing. They know how to train their athletes to make them better. We don't know what's going to make a better pilot yet. We have no idea. And a lot of our warfighters, we don't necessarily know what's going to make them better. And we also really don't know is if we make them stronger, is that going to make them a better pilot? Like there's so many things that are still unknown in our population, which really makes a higher needs. We're talking about needs analysis. Our needs analysis to add more of us in this space to start answering these questions. But beyond that, what we know about the neck, I'll go back to structural now because I've talked a lot about muscular stuff. Structurally wise, the research says there's no difference structurally from a fighter pilot's neck or a pilot's neck to normative values, which blew my mind when I found that out. I thought there was going to be some formality of disc degradation. I thought there was going to be something that was going to be different. And sadly, there wasn't anything different. So it wasn't a structural issue. So then when I saw, I'm like, oh, wow. So now I take this as a grain of salt too, because also when we think about it, like, was there enough data being tested on pilots? There was a decent amount. So I think those are still ongoing. It's like anything else, right? Like
sample size, yeah.
But my mind always goes to, okay, cool. So now it even points me in a greater direction that it must be a muscular thing. Now, in the pilot population, they're fit. Like they're a different breed of military population. It's like dealing with special ops or operators, right? Like they're a different breed. They're not considered general population, but they're not quite like athletes either. So in some of the force and the neck production that I've tested, and even when we talk about cervical endurance type stuff, and we also test a lot of other metrics too in this population. Yeah. They're not quite athletes either. So what I consider pilots, they're more like the mathletes, right? Like they have to be super cognitively induced, and like their cognitive load in that plane is ridiculous, which is a whole that might be episode
that's a whole
2.
Different story. Yeah, that's a whole different. They're right. I mean, it's amazing what some of the researchers at AFRL are doing on that. Can't talk too much about it. That's really neat. Yeah, you talk about where's the information overload, right? But kind of going back, so that's neat that you're saying so structurally. I mean, I in my mind, as a physiologist, structurally a neck's a neck. And so there's no difference between a pilot, everyday person who's not injured or had any chronic diseases. But talk about the muscular. You're talking about you identified it as the muscular side of it, right? Okay. When you had that epiphany, what was your next steps? Because I know it is like to kind of have that insight and trying how to forge forward. It's always an interesting process.
Well, my first line of understanding this, and it's something that it's going to take time. It's going to get done. I believe it wholeheartedly. Is baselines. So what does a successful pilot have, right? So my goal in this, it's in the process, is trying to find some of these instructional pilots and get what their neck strength looks like, or get what their, we do the Sorensen test too for lower back endurance and stuff like that too. So what do their metrics look like? And then I want to work my way backwards, right? So where I'm currently at, I'm in the flight training unit. So essentially what's going to happen is they went through undergraduate training and they flew the 38s and all the smaller aircraft that don't pull as much G's. Yeah. And now we're getting to the major leagues. We're the big boys now, right? Yeah. So they come here for pilot training and then they'll go off to their duty station, the CAF. And then, in due time, they might go to weapons school, or they're going to come back here and be instructional pilots. So my ultimate goal right now is to test those guys that are currently at the weapons school, test those instructional pilots. And we have a lot of instructional pilots here too. So I'm going to be able to do all this. Yeah. And see what their baselines look like. So then I could go all the way back from the start and say, cool, you're getting ready to start flying. Your neck strength should be this. Your neck endurance should be this. Your lower back strength should be this, because this is what the top dogs are doing right now, guys and girls. So when I say dogs, guys, right? So we have a lot of female pilots as well. So that's kind of where I am, just trying to bridge the gap and get a better understanding of things. And then I can start doing a comparative analysis and kind of start gauging on how we should be training them. But wholeheartedly, what we have been doing is incrementally start inducing loads to the neck to try to get it stronger. Because there is some data that shows that, a stronger neck is better at reducing injuries, which makes perfect sense. Like, if you think practicality wise, like you wouldn't want your football player or, you talked about like you said doing karate, like you wouldn't want, God forbid they get hit in the head. You don't want a limp noodle neck that gets hit in the head and all this. You want their neck muscle, their musculature to withstand some formality of force, right? So it's like
exactly
thinking simplistically, but then also using science to kind of support that simple thought.
That's amazing. I love the fact that you talked about creating the baseline. So because the baseline works twofold, both for performance and rehab, right? Because you get injured here, right? So for example, right, I know what my baseline grip strength was. It's 80 pounds. Post, a week after the surgery, went in with my physical therapist, 3 days after surgery, went with my physical therapist, did it, 60 pounds. All right. So I have a 20-pound decrement that I need to do over these next, I don't know, however weeks till it mends to kind of get back up to baseline. It's twofold. And I love that you're talking about is you're trying to create a normative baseline, right? And you can use it both sides. You can work for, incoming pilots, sustainment, return to mission processes. And that's huge.
100%. Yeah. And you alluded to this earlier, like that's imperative too on what I'm doing. Cause I'm kind of like the mitigating factor in this medical space, right? So you have your flight docs who supersede everything, right? They're the ones that have the ability to go or no go a pilot.
Yeah.
And then you have our embedded PTs that are treating these pilots continuously, and we're just trying to make them more badass, essentially, for lack of better terms. But now when we understand these baselines and we understand these metrics, this is something where, if a pilot is having sustainable pain, it seems to be kind of a chronic thing, but if their chronic pain, say it's usually at like a 6, well, I'm making up numbers here, right?
Yeah.
6 out of 10, right? Yeah. And all of a sudden they go do flight and they do something weird, right? Or something they're like, we watch some of the videos where, oh my God, this is great. So a pilot, and it's nowhere in their career, but they'll mess up and they'll look down and they'll go into a flight maneuver and they'll pull G's and they're stuck like this. But they can't get out of it because they're doing some maneuver. Well, that will rip the neck apart, and that has been shown. So say they do something silly like that, and then they'll go to the PT like, look, doc, I'm at a 9. Well, now understanding that baseline is like, well, they're going to treat them and do whatever they need to do to get them better. But how does the flight doc know that they're ready to go back into that cockpit? How does the PT know that they're ready to go back in that cockpit? Because any athlete, fighter, pilot, special ops, anybody, oh no, we're good. I'm good. I'm ready to go back in. Yeah, you're like, oh yeah, I'm good. I'm ready to go. Like whatever you're doing, it's like, no, you just got gashed up and you have a plate in your arm. You're not ready yet, and you're still only pulling 60 pounds. Like, so it is one of those things that is absolutely necessary to create. And I know we've only talked about the neck and the back, but there's other aspects that need to be created, and we need to understand baselines. And going back to my conversation about athletes, D1, any athlete, D1 mostly and professional because they have all the metrics to be captured, but there's baselines for all those guys, and there's an understanding on what needs to be done because, lo and behold, like soccer players tend to get hurt a lot. We talk about ACL tears and stuff like that.
Yeah. Oh, geez. Yeah.
Baselines that are created for that.
Yeah.
And granted, there's some wavering on that, but it's like you can't take an athlete or a special ops or pilot's word for it because they're always going to be like, they could be at a 9 and they're like, nah, I feel like a 6 or a 7. I feel good. Let me jump back in the plate. So it's like, we have to have some formality of objectivity. Yeah. Is it perfect? No, but some of these things are never going to be perfect. We just have to use what we got, Kurt.
But I know, I know exactly what you're talking about. Deal with my team as well. But one of the things that kind of helps with that though too is so you get to see the same people day in and day out, and you build these relationships with them too. So that really, it being embedded, that really helps with that. So you have the subjective side of it as well. and you can talk with them and kind of understand what's going on. So, objective is everything, not everything. It's a good chunk of it, but it's not everything. And having that relationship and being embedded like you are really helps with that. And that's an amazing spot to be in.
Yeah, no. And you actually just brought up another point that I might kind of rotate our conversation a little bit. So
yeah,
metrics. I look, we live and die by metrics to a capacity, but metrics now, and I was just at a conference in DC, DSI conference, and between all of the different military and even Space Force, it's wearables, metrics, yep. data, and I'm like, oh my God, I want to throw up from all this data talk, and I love data. Like it's just, but it's like some of those metrics could be overemphasized too, and it could be misconstrued. Like, I don't know if we want to go down the wearable rabbit hole, but it's one of those
Let's
things.
Save that for another episode. Yeah.
Yeah. But my point being with that bringing that up is it doesn't need to be overemphasized. And when I was given a talk at this thing, and I wanted to make sure I made a point to them. I'm like, look, we could take all these quantitative aspects. Great. I love it. But the qualitative aspect of the human being, the human weapon system has to be accounted for too. Like you just said, like creating relationships, you have to have that comfortable conversation because especially in this space when pilots are deathly afraid of getting their flight pulled, right? Or getting denied, what we established that as. They're deathly afraid of that, which essentially, if they don't have a cool flight doc, they'll never go see that. So having that relationship is one of the most, I would probably say is step one if you're embedded. So some of those listeners who are actually embedded in units, you got to know your team and they got to trust you, because if they don't trust you, there's going to be a segregation there that won't allow you to fully do your job or capable of doing your job.
Yeah. Yeah, I kind of went into that same situation when we brought Aura rings, and that was one of the conversations we had. So for those who don't know about Aura, it's a ring it's a sleep monitor. It does a whole bunch of other stuff now, but mainly we use it for kind of sleep monitoring. And same thing. The issue was, okay, if we use these, can this be used as part of our medical file to take us, off status? And quickly said, no. We answered that question. And that's a question that is constantly asked every time a new biowearable is brought into the system is, okay, is it going to be used for medical use, right? And then, okay, if it is, how's it going to be tracked? Especially, is it going to be brought into the military medical record system, X, Y, and Z? So it's a whole bunch of questions that have to get asked. But that first thing that you hit on, is it going to take me off status? I know this thing's going to be great to give me that, those incremental gains I'm looking for, but at the same time, is it going to be a double-edged sword? And that's what they really don't want.
So I'm going to ask you a question, and I want this to kind of create conversation because this is always on my forefront of my mind. So we concentrate on all these metrics and we make it a point to essentially kind of establish baselines like we talked about. We kind of try to return to work and return to flight status or whatever it might be. But what about this, right? I've never been in war. I've never fought in battle. But I've worked with plenty of guys and girls who have. Like I said, I was in from 01 to 05, so I understood what was firing. And, I've worked with military members my whole entire career. But what about this? So we say, well, if you, going back to your wearable thing, well, you only got 6 hours of sleep and your HRV is in the red. Oh, God, don't get me started on that. Maybe you should lay off today. Well, what happens if we go to war again? Like, your sleep is not going to be good. Your eating's not going to be good. You're going to be overworked. Like, knowing that, speaking to some pilots before that have been in the trenches when, for lack of a better term, shit hit the fan, they didn't sleep. They're flying way more sorties than they've ever flown before in their life. So it's like, so how do we get ready for that? Like, what do we do to safeguard because, we're adaptogens, right? So how do we safeguard that?
So in my opinion, the way I approach it is twofold. First off is kind of what we've been talking about. Okay, what is that question that we're trying to answer with that metric, right? And then how are we going to utilize it, right? So that's the first thing. The second part is like with all this other stuff, right? So let's talk the Aura. So first thing is like, okay, like the one things I briefed is to my team is, look, I'm not going to try to, I would love for you guys to get 8 hours, the team, everyone to get 8 hours, but it's not going to happen. It's a teaching tool. And that's the second point. I use them as teaching tools, is to understand their bodies. Is okay, you can only get, let's say, you can only average 6 hours a day or a night. How can we optimize that, right? How can we get your sleep better? So, okay, when you're having to work your stressful periods, your body's reacting, and you know how to mitigate that. For me, I really use a lot of this data as a teaching mechanism, because they want to see. My team loves to see actionable data. That's their term, not mine. Actionable data, something that's tangible, cause and effect, and that's how I use it. So yeah, even though like in the performance center, I'm collecting like 12 different metrics for to create a performance report card to really kind of understand the nuances in their energy systems and their strength and power. Especially because we were able to correlate to the operationalization of these metrics, right? So like we were saying, what you're doing with your neck measurements is you're operationalizing that metric, something that really relates to what they're doing in the field, in your case, in the skies. So that's what we're doing. But then when it comes to this other stuff, it's like, okay, how do you understand your body? And then, okay, if you change this factor, how's that body react? And so that, for me, that's how I do it. And that's how I try to teach it to other coaches, other physiologists, other data scientists, X, Y, and Z.
No, I love that. Now, let me ask you this. This is a question. So I've heard.
I think I'm the one that's supposed to ask questions, not you.
I know, but you have a ton of experience too. This is a great conversation.
Oh, I know. I love it.
No, I've heard. So, and this is where I had a little bit pushback with some of the instructional pilots, but in small talk inside of our facility, I overheard, directly overheard, where they would purposely sleep deprive themselves to understand how much cognitive load was needed to fly in a deprivation type of period. Now, right or wrong, good tactic or not tactic, but how do you feel about that?
Okay, so I'm going to say this right now. What I'm about ready to say has no reflection on DoD policy, X, Y, and Z. This is just Chris Myers as a physiologist talking. No, I don't agree with that. It's something that's very dangerous and should be done in a controlled lab or an environment, right? Because that's why we have flight simulators, to be able to do stuff like that and be able to get those metrics. For example, we take it a little bit safer. Every so often I get a teammate that they do intermittent fasting. And I'm not talking just like the 8 hour, 12 hour. I'm talking about the 18 hour, 24. And they're getting ready to go to the field. And it's like trying to train their body to deal with, lack of nutrition out in the field. That's not how it works. And even in endurance sports, it's been disproven to really kind of do like fasted rides or fasted runs ever so often, right? I'd have athletes that would want to try to do them 2-3 times a week. And it shows it actually hampers performance versus that metabolic flexibility that people are looking for. So there's some things you can do personally, but before you do it, speak to your team. Speak to your performance professionals, speak to your medical professionals. This is why we're there. And if you don't have one, speak to your primary care physician. And that's why the flight, I know most flight docs have a open door policy. And every flight doc that I've ever worked with has been phenomenal and very open too. So that's what I would say.
100%. And I'll tell you, my response to that is I try to educate them because look, there's so much misinformation in the world today. Like, oh my God, we could throw up. But my rebuttal to them is, so in preparations, right? Like, we train to be great. We train in all the right aspects, or nutrition. Like, we train to be in a really good, cognitive, physical load, right? But when lack of better terms, shit hits the fan, when it's time of war and that does happen, there's a glorious thing in our body that we produce from our adrenal glands called, well, part of it called epinephrine. Yep. And that will carry a lot of situations. Like I'm not that fast anymore because I'm getting older, right? Let's be honest. But if something gets weird, I'm going to be fast again. I promise you, because that epinephrine is going to get me to that point. But that's like some of the things I'm like, there's certain things that you don't necessarily need to train for because you're not going to adapt to a deprived sleep state. That's not going to, that doesn't work like that. So point being in that situation was your response was incredible. And, you know, those are just some of the things that us being practitioners just kind of need to rebuttal and just make sure that we're doing things in a safe manner, right? Like if you want to try that in the simulator, have at it. Awesome. Like go on with your bad self. But anyway, that was just something that I always think about and I like to get other practitioners' opinions on because it's out there. It's a thing.
Well, we've even talked about kind of doing that something like that locally too. It's just finding time on the calendar to really do it. But it also brings up some other ethics, ethics discussions as well. But yeah, so that's another discussion for another time. But yes, that is, we get that quite a bit. But man, we could probably go off for another couple hours on here.
No, without a doubt. We can go too much long because my computer's going to die.
There you go. Yeah. Well, so kind of wrapping it up, what I always like to try to do is have my guests, like, if you have like one or two nuggets of just wisdom you can give to either our HWS populations or our HWS HP professionals, what would you give?
Oh, that's a good question. So, and I think we're getting better at this, so I might need to change my answer at some point. But
okay,
it has to be, the personalization has to be primary, right? Even though we're dealing with population steps, you have to find that human weapon system, and whatever you want to implement, it has to be directed towards that, right? The other thing is making sure that we're thinking about the holistic approach. And I know that's a terminology that's kind of been overused now. And that's why I think I need to find something new, because we're doing that now. I think we're accounting for certain things, like things that we have never accounted for before, like spirituality and, meditation and other kind of mental capacities. Now we're accounting for it.
Life cycle management. Life cycle management, teaching, learning. Out of the last HWS working group, it was like up to 32 different possible domains. It was amazing. Versus the typical 5-domain model that you see with the tactical athlete model.
Yeah, no, 100%. And it all has to, like, understanding one's personal life too, because that will directly affect, like, we know that. We don't have to get into that. And the other thing is making sure that we're utilizing a mixed methodology, and it just cannot be this quantitative aspect where we're taking data and we're making decisions. Like, we have to take the weapon system, the human weapon system, and account for that as well. And that goes into the big holistic approach too, right? Like, you're taking all of this into one, and then you're making your decision. And I feel like that decision sometimes is preemptive to where it might just be too soon. Like, we have to make sure that we're getting all the information and then make the decision. That would be my best advice.
Excellent. Well, man, this has been great. I mean, I always learn something talking with you. Our conversations are a blast. Your presentation that you just did with the seminar has been awesome. I just read over your chapter in the new book, which, by the way, that's all coming out here in a few months. More to come out, more to follow, people.
I'm excited about that.
Tony, it's always great to hear from you. Yeah, thanks for being part of this. Thanks for helping kick off this show. I love it. And also, I want to thank you to the audience. Thanks for listening. Thanks for being part of us. And finally, I want to thank our sponsor, our title sponsor, Play, just being a great partner with us. Mark and Erica, you guys have been fabulous. So let's keep on keeping on. And I'll see you all next time. Take care.